I'm Lori McCauley, Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2024 DEI Disability Conference toward an Anti-Ableist Academy. I have to, yes! Welcome to all of you in the room and those who have joined us online as well. I have to say that this is an area that is really a passion of mine, and I'm here to learn. So I'm really looking forward to our session today. As we begin, I want to recognize an important part of our history, a land transfer from the indigenous people of this area. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the single largest land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremoniously as a gift through the treaty at the foot of the rapids so that their children could be educated. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. I'm really excited to be here. I've been energized by working with disability advocates on our campus for many years. And when I learned that 1 in 4 people in the state of Michigan and 1 in 4 people in the United States have a disability, it became clear to me that we need to up our game in this area. It's really important that our students understand the landscape of disability and that they are better prepared to flourish in the world through that understanding. So for me, being an Anti-Ableist Academy means supporting those who work and learn here, as well as ensuring our students have a nuanced understanding of disability. So not only supporting our community with disabilities, but making sure our students are educated so that they can be effective in a world and supporting people after they graduate. Well, a nuanced understanding of anything, including disability, means being willing to grow. The word disability covers a lot of ground and a huge spectrum of human experience. And as I said, I'm passionate about disability advocacy, but I'm not an expert, and I know there's a lot that I can learn and need to know in this space to be an advocate myself for our campus. So I'm looking forward to Dr. Sweener's presentation today myself. We need intellectual humility to be able to understand people's experiences, and this is especially important for leaders and policymakers, so I take this really seriously. My interest in supporting people with disabilities has crystallized a few things for me. Like all groups of people, those with disabilities are not a monolith. Every human being, including those with disabilities, has different interests, preferences, and personalities. And the only way to understand this diversity is really an old-fashioned way, and that's by getting to know individuals. So the core of this work on a personal human level is actually quite simple, but it takes effort. It's curiosity and compassion. And from those values, others will emerge like respect and inclusion. The more I learn about people with disabilities, the more I realize I have yet to learn. And that's good news because I love learning. And we just so happen to be in a place that has that as its specialty. Of course, working to build an anti-ableist academy is much larger than the important personal dimension or commitment. In leadership, we think about how to be more inclusive for people with disabilities in 2 ways: being both responsive and proactive. Being responsive means being warm and inviting in scenarios where people tell us what they need It means providing ample inroads to those conversations for every employee and student on our campus. The other part is being proactive, and that means measures that we know will help many people, like creating curb cuts, crosswalks, elevators with accessibility and disability in mind. And I've had the good fortune to partner with Tabby Chavis on some of this work through some of the building projects that we have on campus, and acknowledging that just meeting the ADA standard is too low of a bar for our campus. It also means making accessibility part of our normative practices, whether we're designing websites, programs, or calling a meeting, a session like we have today. We're thinking about the ways to make it easier for people to participate equitably. As many in the disability community will tell you, public interest in supporting disabilities can come in waves. And that makes advocacy in events like this all the more important. I'm really thrilled to help the momentum of this work on our campus. I want to make sure to thank a lot of people who are instrumental in this work and in this session today. Our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, led by Tabby Chavis. Thank you for your partnership, Tabby. The Towards an Anti-Ableist Academy Planning Committee, the Office of University and Development Events, our U of M Center for Disability Health and Wellness, Services for Students with Disabilities, Student Accessibility and Accommodation Services, Disability Culture at the University of Michigan, the Council for Disability Concerns, and I'd also like to give a shout out to Greg Teachout in the Provost's office, our Director of Communications, who's been a partner, and Christopher Fries, who is one of our newer Vice Provosts for Academic and Faculty Affairs, also a Professor of Nursing, who has been really instrumental in helping us launch some academic initiatives in this space. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Debbie Willis, our Assistant Vice Provost in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, who will welcome us and introduce our speaker today. Debbie?
Thank you, Provost McCulley, and good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all. I have the great pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker today, Dr. Bonnie Lynn Sweener. She's an epidemiologist and an endowed professor of disability health and justice at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing and joint appointments at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She is the founding director of the Johns Hopkins Disability Health Research Center, which aims to shift the paradigm from living with a disability to thriving with a disability. Her research is motivated by her personal experience with disability and focusing on advancing equity for disabled people, promoting disability inclusion and accessibility in research settings, and developing evidence-based and disability-inclusive policies. Because Dr. Sweener's expertise has broad applications, she works across sectors and settings to help translate research into policy change, including co-leading efforts that led the NIH to designate people with disabilities as a health disparity population. Please help me welcome Dr. Sweener.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation to be here. I'm Bonnie Sweener, as was introduced, and I'll start with my visual description for inclusion. I'm a middle-aged, closer to 50 than 40, white woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, wearing a blue jacket for Michigan Support Today, and a dark black top and a gold necklace. I just want to start with thanking you all for being here, taking the time, and for all the good things happening at this campus, at this university, at this institution, to support people with disabilities, advancing the conversation on disability inclusion, equity, and accessibility. It really has been amazing to witness from my perspective. You're really leading the charge, and I'm grateful. So today I am going to talk a bit about how we can address ableism in research settings, in healthcare settings, and in higher education. I want to start with this quote. That's one of my favorites from a disability activist and actually also a comedian from Australia, Stella Young. It says, "No amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp." I'm sure many of you have heard or interacted with this quote before. And I like this quote because it runs through my mind often, because the societal view around creating an inclusive world for people with disabilities is still one that it's up to disabled people. Right? That it is our job as people with disabilities to change the world so we can fit in, or sometimes change ourselves. But that's not the case, and I think this quote illustrates it. I also like the part about smiling in this quote, which is often, I think, the overlooked nuance, and that we're also expected to be happy about the fight, to not be angry or upset in our pushback. And that's tough to do some days, certainly. Many of you can attest. On the left hand of the slide, I'm also showing a set of escalator stairs going up from a DC Metro stop. And I'm sharing this because this is the exact place where my own journey with disability began. So I have a visual disability, and my vision loss began very rapidly as I was walking up those Metro steps on a sunny January day in 2005, and it was completely unexpected. I didn't know exactly what was going on. I had sudden vision loss in one of my eyes, but I subsequently was diagnosed with a degenerative retinal condition, and I've been losing my vision in both eyes ever since for almost 20 years, which is hard to believe. But at that time, I had just sent in applications about a month or so before to Masters of Public Health programs, something that I had worked really hard to get to. I worked hard to get through college, worked multiple jobs to get through college, and this was a dream. And when I realized that my vision loss was both permanent and would continue to decline, I thought that my career as a researcher, as a public health professional, as an academic was over before it felt like it really had even started. And that's because I didn't know anyone like me working in research, anyone who is blind or had a disability. And so I, of course, thought I couldn't. In the job I had, I was having immense challenges with just doing my job, and there wasn't any opportunities. I had no community of support, and it was a very stressful time. I got into a Masters of Public Health program at Hopkins and deferred because I didn't think I could do it. And that was frustrating. And honestly, it was a very dark period where I bought into all the stereotypes of disability that society had taught me. I thought I was lesser. I thought I couldn't. I honestly thought I had less value to contribute to this world. But I'm also incredibly stubborn. And I felt like that couldn't be it. That couldn't be it for this job and career that I wanted so very much. So I gave it a try, and I took one course at a time and tried to figure out how I could possibly do this. And in that process, I learned a few things. I learned, one, that I could figure it out, and it was tough. But two, that the infrastructure, the system, was not really built to include people like me, and that was a little bit concerning. I started to really recognize and pay attention to the signs and signals that I wasn't meant to be in those places and spaces of learning, but that felt wrong. I was also learning about disability in ways that didn't feel right, that didn't match how I was experiencing it, in ways in public health that we're still teaching, that disability is something to prevent, to fear, to treat at all costs. So what did that mean for someone like me who was already there, who already had a disability? So certainly that has shaped the career trajectory that I've had and led me to the work that I do today. And I thought it was important to share that positionality and that history before I give the comments that I am about to give. But I also want to say that when I share those things and that story, it's important to understand that my view isn't that I've gotten here because I've overcome anything. My disability is part of who I am. It's part of my identity. And I am now proud of that. I haven't always been. That's not always the case. That's not always the view. And I don't share this story to serve as some inspiration because there are so many, and I'm sure many even in this space, on this room, online, who have very similar stories. These barriers and these challenges are unfortunately the norm. And many people are still facing these barriers that have yet to be addressed. And that's a problem because, as the provost indicated in the beginning, more than 1 in 4 American adults has a disability. That's more than 70 million Americans, and we know that's an underestimate. I'm not going to get into the disability data discourse for those of you that follow that. But what that means is that people with disabilities are part of all of our communities. And that also means that the ways in which we talk about disability, we include people with disabilities, we study disability, we research disability matters because it matters for a significant proportion of our populations and of all of our communities. But the world is still not designed for us. And what I'm showing on this illustration is an infographic or an animation from CDC of a library. And when we build a library, how we've always built libraries, with tall shelves, people of shorter stature or people who are wheelchair users cannot reach the top shelves. We're still designing libraries this way. But if we design from the beginning with inclusion in mind, with shelves lower to the ground, then everyone could access all the information. But we're not quite there yet. It's important to understand what is also going on in the backdrop of these conversations in society. The social movement in the disability community has shifted from disability rights to disability justice. Disability rights was all about ensuring people with disabilities have the same rights as people without disabilities. And that was an important movement that got us important civil rights protections like the Americans with Disabilities Act. But as we've learned for so many populations and groups, giving everyone the same thing doesn't get us to where we all want to be. Disability justice is recognizing that we need to focus on equity, and we need to think more about the inequities that people with disabilities from intersecting communities and identity groups face. So disability justice is a framework that understands that all bodies are unique and essential, and all bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. So when I started the Disability Health Research Center, which I started in 2019, as again was indicated in my intro, I spent some time thinking about how to best message what we're trying to do. how we're trying to uplift the principles of disability justice within research spaces to change the conversation on how we're including people with disabilities, how we're studying and teaching about people with disabilities. And so we came up with this tagline, shifting the paradigm from living with a disability to thriving with a disability. And so often we use that word, living with a disability, or that phrase, right? And just think about that phrase for a minute. And I'm not saying this to shame anyone who uses these phrases, but gosh, I hope everyone here with a disability is living, right? Because we're in this space. So what does that imply? That it is a burden, that it is negative, inherently framing it that way, right? But we want to change the conversation to doing more than just living, more than just surviving. How do we get to thriving? That's not been the conversation for so long. But to tackle that, we need to really think about the reasons people with disabilities are facing inequities or barriers. And there's two primary reasons, two primary drivers, ableism and inaccessibility. And we're here today to talk about ableism or anti-ableism, but we also have to talk about accessibility, which is an interrelated but slightly different construct. Both of these constructs hold back research, hold back the potential of science, and hold back knowledge and information for the next generation. And I want to talk a bit about that. So ableism, just to define that for this space, and there's many different definitions, excellent definitions of ableism, but I always gravitate to this very short definition from Amanda Morris, who's a journalist at the Washington Post, who has a disability herself and covers the disability beat. And I'm just so glad that there's now disability beats in many mainstream media outlets. And Amanda writes, ableism is rooted in the assumption that non-disabled people are the ideal. And if you think about that, it's very simple, but it really gets right to it. We are still taught that being disabled is a non-ideal state, right? And in so many places, that goes unquestioned, unchallenged. That's ableism. But ableism comes in many forms when you start to unpack it. There's personal ableism or interpersonal ableism, where you feel uncomfortable just being around someone with a disability, particularly a visible disability, where people with disabilities are perceived to get some sort of advantages in life, and that there's some assigned hierarchy to severity of disability. You're more or less disabled in a variety of settings, right? There's complexity there. There's also structural ableism that comes from our laws and our policies that restrict the freedom and equity for people with disabilities. Structural ableism also comes from efforts to eliminate disability. This is a tough one in many spaces we're still inhabiting. Not as a benefit to an individual, but to society, and that's the difference. Academic ableism, which is what we're here today having discussions about, which is viewing disability and disabled people only as our subjects of study, not as those amongst our staff, our students, our faculty, our colleagues, our friends, our families. Excluding disability from our diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility efforts and the data we collect, the metrics we're reporting out. An illegal or accommodations-only approach. So often this happens in many settings, that if we're, as was discussed again by the provost in the beginning, if we're just meeting that very baseline of legal standards, we're doing all we need to. That's academic ableism, and it happens so often. Recently, Dr. Lisa Meeks, who's here at this university, published this paper with a number of colleagues about the inaccessible road to science for people with disabilities, and developed this framework of that cycle. And it really is a cycle. Starts with the systemic ableism that's happening in academia and in research settings that drives unconscious bias, lack of inclusive policies, barriers to learning and education for disabled people and non-disabled people, reduced opportunities, lower representation in STEM for people with disabilities, fewer role models, and mentors, I'll say, which perpetuates and deepens ableism and continues this cycle. We need to find ways to break this cycle. And we need to think at this level of detail of how we are going to do it. Is it at the policy level? Is it at the education level? Do we have to pull multiple levers at once? So that's ableism, but as I indicated, we also have to think in tandem about accessibility, and we have to work on both together to get to change. Accessibility, when I talk about accessibility, it's more than physical accessibility, which is critical and essential. It's also ensuring equitable access to information, interactions, services, programs, facilities, and conversations. A core component of making sure something that is accessible that often is not included in the conversation is what's called equivalent ease of use. So what I mean by that is, as a person with a visual disability, if I can complete a task, but it takes me 5 times as long as someone who doesn't have a disability, that is nowhere near equivalent ease of use. That is a tax on my time and my effort. That's not true accessibility. The other component of accessibility, as I indicated when I began this conversation, that's often ignored is that it is every single one of our responsibility. In all that we do all day, every day, we make decisions about accessibility, about making things accessible, and we have opportunities to improve accessibility. This is a quote and a snapshot from a great book called Demystifying Disability. Emily Ladau is a great friend and colleague who wrote this book. And in this book, which has many great topics, is a great disability 101 guide. Emily talks about the reasons that are commonly given of why we're not making things inclusive and accessible for people with disabilities. It's too expensive. It's too much effort. It won't look nice. There's not enough time. And what happens so often, that's not our job. And we need to think about how we can change these conversations and create a culture and an ethos of prioritizing accessibility. And there's ways to do it, right? Many in this room, I'm sure, if you're educators, have learned about universal design for learning, which comes from a larger set of principles around universal design. These principles, there's 7. They include equitable use of design, flexibility of design, meaning you have more than one way to interact with the design, that the design is simple and intuitive, that information is perceptible, high contrast, for example. There's a low tolerance for error. If you make a mistake, it's not the computer crashing, for example. Low physical effort. You don't create a ramp that requires immense arm strength to go up for a wheelchair user. And there's appropriate size and space for use. So those are the 7 core principles that can be applied in almost any setting. And the idea behind universal design principles are that we're designing for many and not just for some. Learning these principles, understanding how to apply them in every situation can help us create more inclusive and accessible spaces, places, information, knowledge. An example, which also was given, I think, by the provost in the beginning, are curb cuts and tactile curb cuts, which is even an improvement on the original curb cuts. Designed for people who are wheelchair users, but certainly benefits people who are riding bikes, people who are carrying suitcases, are pushing strollers, and now with the tactile sensors, the tactile raises, help people who have low vision or are blind, or even if you're not paying attention and you're texting on your phone. Okay. So ableism and inaccessibility are not just barriers to the impact of the work that we do in education, in higher ed, in research, but they also impact the workforce. There's a great book by Jay Dolmage that talks about academic ableism. I strongly encourage it. And a quote, one of my favorite quotes from this book is, "The university erects steep steps to keep certain bodies and minds out." And you think about how this is applied. We have weeder courses. We have all sorts of ways that we siphon people out of processes. Are you fit to be, at some elite level of education or research? There are tones of ableism across all of that. Should we not instead be designing learning environments, information, knowledge, so that it meets people's needs, instead of having one way and that it only works for certain groups? That's not how higher ed has historically been designed. So at my center, we were interested, because we heard from a lot of the undergrads we worked with, in trying to develop some basic metrics of how inclusive universities are. This is a challenge. There's not a lot of data on this that is publicly available or shared. As a center, we believe in the democratization of data to drive social change. This is something that we do. And so we developed some metrics based on publicly available information on university websites, as well as the accessibility of university web pages, of how inclusive undergraduate universities are. And we looked at the top 50 universities based on NIH funding. We did this because there are civil rights laws that apply here. The Rehabilitation Act states that if you receive federal funding, that you cannot discriminate on the basis of disability in institutions that get that funding. What we found, and this was not intended to really meet all the tenets of the Rehab Act, it was just intended to develop a conversation and some simple metrics to see where we're at in higher ed. And what we found is the majority of universities that we assessed were not doing so well. Got a D or an F. So the metrics we had were, is there a clear grievance process for undergraduate students when they're not getting accommodations? Is there language that meets criteria around that process? Are there accessible maps that are available for students to help them get around campus? This information is all publicly available and downloadable, but the idea here is that we have room to grow as an area in higher education to include our students. What we heard from the students who worked on this project and who we talked with when we developed this project is this information matters to prospective students who are simply just trying to figure out if they'll fit in, if a higher education is for them. But it's not just for our undergrad students. This is also data from Lisa Meeks, who's on faculty here, who has done great work in showing the inclusion or lack thereof of students with disabilities in medical school. And in 2016, her research found that only 2.7% of medical students report having a disability. And although that's increased to 4.6% in 2019, that is far from parity. That's far from the more than quarter of American adults in the United States living in communities that have a disability. We've got work to do. Additionally, this is data from NSF, National Science Foundation, showing that less than 3% of our STEM, our science, technology, engineering, mathematics workforce report having a disability, less than 3%. But what's striking is that this is the only group that has had no change in representation over the past decade, indicating we are not doing perhaps anything to improve this picture for disability inclusion in science. On this slide, I'm showing data that I published on the percentage of National Institute of Health, NIH, principal investigators that have a disability. And this is data from 2008 to 2018. And what the data that we obtained showed that from between that decade, there was a decline. 1.9% to 1.2% of funded investigators from NIH reported having a disability. I'll also add I had to get these data through a Freedom of Information Act request, but that's a different story. The data are now available, thankfully, but certainly not a great picture. Our data mirrors what NSF, the National Science Foundation, has long been reporting. Over a similar time period, about 1% of investigators with NSF funding report having a disability. Little change over that time. All of this together indicates we have done such little to move the needle on disability inclusion in science and research. On top of that, my center recently published information or data showing we have a pay gap issue. Disabled scientists earn less. People working in STEM with doctorate degrees that have a disability earn more than $10,000 per year less than people without disabilities. And if you work in academia, it's worse. It's more than $14,000 per year. Yet when we talk about pay gaps or pay inequities, people with disabilities are almost never part of that conversation. We also were interested in having conversations, we did a qualitative study to understand the barriers that faculty conducting research who also have disabilities are facing in these environments. And here's a few quotes. The one that I have in bold and red always sticks with me. I've never had a mentor with a disability. I hear this so often from students that come to me, my colleagues. Sometimes I think there's a perception that researchers or academics with disabilities, especially those that disclose their disabilities, are only, in quotes, advocates. The pandemic gave me the accommodations the institution wouldn't. It's ridiculous that I'm regularly the only disabled person in a room, a group, etc., focused on the study of people with disabilities. This happens far too often. The whole problem with academia is it presumes you're able to put in a 60-hour week. It's that grind culture. We heard a lot about that from the faculty we talked to. So despite this negative picture, I want to end on more of an asset-based conversation of including people with disabilities in the workforce. While there's not enough of this research in academia and research settings, there is data from corporate America showing that including people with disabilities on teams actually leads to increased productivity and enhanced creativity. And there's additional gain when the leaders are people with disabilities themselves, and on the team, there's people with disabilities. We've got a lot to learn, I think, in academia. So with all of that background and information, what do we do? Where do we go from here? There's clearly a need for systemic change and actions, things that we all can do to get us to change to a better place. And some of that is underway. It's a really interesting moment happening right now, and in my mind, an exciting moment. These conversations like this are happening more and more, and they're being taken more seriously, and I'm really grateful for that. But we have to keep this momentum going. So a strong signal started from an early executive order under this administration. I know we shouldn't get overly political, but this was helpful in a lot of the efforts that we use to drive change at a federal level. And this was an executive order on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And accessibility was there specifically to make sure people with disabilities were part of DEI efforts within the federal government. A quote from that executive order: "Because a workforce that includes people with disabilities is a stronger and more effective workforce." But that DEIA ethos hasn't taken hold far beyond the federal government yet. That A, too often, is being left out of the conversation. But we capitalized on that DEIA executive order on this committee, and I'm showing a list of names of committee members that was formed at the NIH to advise leadership on how to improve the inclusion of people with disabilities at the NIH. So this is a very long federal name. the advisory committee to the director, work group on diversity, subgroup on individuals with disabilities. I had the honor to co-chair this along with Lisa Iazzoni from Harvard and Steve Barnett from Rochester. And this was motivated by a number of things, including those data I showed you on the low percentage of NIH investigators that report having a disability that I published using Freedom of Information Act request data. And this was an amazing group, many of whom had disabilities themselves, the majority. We met for 18 months, and we produced a set of sweeping recommendations. We really swung for the fences on purpose to NIH leadership. And really we're hoping to make a statement that there's a lot of work to do, but we can do this. It wasn't clear how these recommendations were going to be received, but we were surprised and grateful that our recommendations were unanimously endorsed in December of 2022 by the advisory committee to the director, which then meant it was up to NIH leadership to determine how to see them forward. We were also pleasantly surprised that not too long after that, the NIH released a revised strategic plan on DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, which included responses to many of our recommendations and having a clear, for the first time ever, a clear focus on disability inclusion. Additionally, one of our primary recommendations was designating people with disabilities as a health disparity population, something that the community had been asking for years. And this was certainly a fight. After our committee's recommendations, this was taken up by the director of the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparity Director, who has the power to give this designation in consultation with the director of AHRQ. And that director was not quite sure what to do on the designation and called an external counsel to help him make the decision. That external counsel recommended to not give this designation. And in a public meeting last fall, they shared their concerns with giving this designation, which in my mind were ableist, quite frankly. They also acknowledged not a single committee member had or openly disclosed a disability on that deciding committee. That happened on a Friday, and I could not sleep at all that night. I was very concerned about what this would mean for the future of these conversations, for the barriers that would happen moving forward. And so I called my colleague Jay Kennedy at Washington State University, who was watching this very closely with me. And then we called Tony Coelho, who's a former congressman that introduced the Americans with Disabilities Act on the floor of Congress. And we decided that we were going to start a letter writing campaign and collect signatures to petition the NIH to make this designation. And to our surprise, in less than 48 hours, we had well over 1,000 signatures, almost 2,000 signatures, which we sent to the White House, NIH leadership, and HHS leadership. And even to our greater surprise, not too long after that, the NIH announced the designation. And I share this story, and I'm sharing headlines from NIH and the Washington Post, which Amanda Morris, whose quote I used earlier, had the exclusive, because I learned so much in that process that too often as researchers, as academics, we are silenced. We are told that we can't speak out, that we have to stick to the research. But we have opportunities to impact society. And there are moments that are hard, and we are in those moments. This was not an easy pushback. We, as the letter writers, received intense pushback for our pushback. But it has led to such greater good than I could have even imagined. Not too long after the designation, a number of leaders from across the NIH wrote this commentary. One of the first time ever that I had seen NIH publicly use the word ableism. They wrote about ableism in biomedical and behavioral research at NIH. They wrote, "There is space to address both disease-focused research and the health of people with disabilities broadly." This is a new concept for so many. Additionally, on the heels of the designation, there's now been more than $30 million in research funding focused on advancing equity for people with disabilities, not just from NIH, but also from the National Science Foundation. Hopefully we're getting to change. Additionally, there's conversations even happening out of the White House. So at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is in charge of science policy for all of our federal government, there has been multiple conversations on how to ensure our science and technology information, publications, and communication are accessible to everyone. Their principles are, again, similar to what was described by the provost, to not just meet, but to surpass our federal requirements on making sure we're promoting access, and to promote awareness and training on accessibility and disability inclusion. Right now, we are not teaching these concepts to the next generation, so of course, we don't know what to do until we change that. And to invest in technology and research that will improve the ways in which we can make this world more accessible and more disability inclusive. There's work that we as academics and as researchers can do to advance these areas in these fields. STEM plays a really big role, but we haven't taken advantage of that. Additionally, I'm really grateful that the National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine has just announced a large consensus study focusing on addressing ableism in STEM workplaces, and educational settings. If anyone is interested, I will just make a plug. There's nominations open until November 15th. Put your names in. But this is also symbolic, a conversation I never thought would be happening at a place like the National Academies. I think it's a true signal that we are finally moving forward and addressing some of the barriers that so many of you all, so many who aren't even in this space, have faced for far too long. And in this journey and in this conversation, I encourage you all to take up this advice that I received early in my career. And that is to start with your story, but to end with everyone else's. And I want to share this because, again, in this time and moment when these efforts are harder than they should be, where the conversation isn't always a civil one, that it is so important to go back to why we are doing this. And for many of us, it's because of our own personal experiences and the barriers we have faced. But it's also important to get us to a higher place of the conversation, to not just fight for the pain and the barriers we experience, but to understand that of those who are unlike us, so that we can fight for the barriers that those who aren't like us are experiencing. I'm hopeful that that will be the future of the work in the disability space and so many other spaces. But for the conversation on addressing ableism, I think it's particularly pertinent because it is so truly intersectional. And we have to make sure that when we are fighting for the inclusion of people with disabilities, we are thinking very carefully about how to open that space wide open and to fight for all. So I'm always asked to think or to provide some homework or some action items, and I was asked to do that here. And so this will be my just about last slide. Things you can do right now in your places and spaces and with the power that you may hold. And it's to think about ways that you can create a culture that values accessibility. That can range from creating structures and systems to make sure accessibility is part of your processes and procedures. It may include training, developing training in those that you're working with, are including some aspects of accessibility learning in your curriculum as you're teaching. It also may require resources and hiring staff in certain places and spaces for the heavy lifting, meaning we don't all have to have all the solutions, but we need to know enough to do the basics. And to think about ways to use disability inclusive language, because words really do matter. There's a lot to learn. I am constantly reminded in this space because there's not a one-size-fits-all approach here, right? The primary thing to remember is disability is not a bad word. And some people identify as people with disabilities, some disabled people, but to always understand the views of the person in front of you or the people in front of you and reflect that back, just like we do for so many other groups. It's also important to not leave out the word disability in communication. That happens far too often in our efforts to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a data nerd, I always have to have a ask around data because I think without data, we have held back progress. Find ways to fill our knowledge gaps or our data gaps on disability. We're not collecting disability data in the spaces and places we're collecting race, ethnicity, age, gender identity. That means we don't have the evidence and the information in the same ways to identify where and when things are breaking down and the impact of what we're doing. And that absolutely has to change as we are more and more in an evidence-based and data-driven decision-making society. But there's certainly concerns around people disclosing disabilities, even on surveys and forums and information, and that's real. But that's also a social construct. We create that fear. But if you don't collect the data, think about the message that sends, right? That fear is founded. So creating a culture of disclosure is something to think about. And how are you going to use the data? Who's going to have access to the data? And thinking carefully about the questions you're asking. And lastly, but most important, value disabled people's perspectives and expertise. I think we're at a point in this conversation, I don't mean this conversation, but I think in the conversation in society where we do need to think carefully around who is an expert on disability. And for too long, it has not been disabled people. Disabled people aren't often trusted, they're questioned, and we need to think about that. As I described, places of learning in higher education have been built to keep disabled people out. And so oftentimes that does mean going outside our walls to find expertise because we haven't let that expertise in. Building relationships with communities, particularly communities of people with disabilities who are multiply marginalized, and making sure that we are creating spaces where they are valued, where they can be leaders, and certainly finding ways to encourage opportunities for people with disabilities in our staff, in our faculty, and among our students. And with that, I will end it and take some questions, and thank you for listening.
Okay, so while we are waiting on you all to think of your questions, and we'll bring a mic to you, we'll take a question that was online. And so that question is, absolutely wonderful talk. Can you speak to how neurodivergence was considered as a disability in your research and or the research of others?
Oh, that's a big question, but yes, I will try. So, neurodivergence, not everyone who's neurodivergent identifies as having a disability, and I will say that. And that is up to the individual, and that's the right answer to the individual, first and foremost, right? At my center and the work we do, we use a very large umbrella or tent when we are defining disability. And so we use an approach, sorry, that came out very wrong. We use the approach where we include people who are neurodivergent or autistic as included in our view or our umbrella of disability. because a lot of the work that we do is based on data collection and enumerating a population to understand inequities. And from that perspective, making sure we are collecting data on people who are neurodivergent is essential. I think that this question is in lots of ways specific to the situation and the setting, but also, I'm one person. That's my approach in our data collection processes. And it absolutely needs to be driven by the viewpoints of people with that lived experience, which I admittedly don't have. And so we have a researcher in my center doing great work on Black youth who are neurodivergent and transitioning into the workforce. And so as an example, in the work that she's doing is making sure that our co-authors on her papers are from those backgrounds and have those identities to help us make sure we are framing our approach and the way that we're interpreting the data and the language we're using.
Dr. Sweena, we have a question just to your right.
That was really eloquent, and I love the data-centric evidence base of your work, so thank you. We talked a little bit before the presentation about education, and I'm just wondering if you have seen models that you think are particularly effective at other institutions. You don't have to name the institutions, and/or this could be a hypothetical of how you think we can put the data into work to educating our communities.
Great question. So I will share what I hope will happen in the future, right? Because I think everywhere we've got some work to do. So I think in the education space, I have a hope that at some point in time, particularly in STEM curricula, but ideally in every higher education, we will have some aspects of accessibility baked in so that the next generation will know how to make whatever it is they're doing in whatever field they're doing inclusive and accessible, whether that be public health or as a teacher or working in corporate America. There is a need to understand how to do their job, to communicate whatever they're producing or designing, to design for many, not just for some. So that's part of my hope. We don't do that well now. We don't have that infrastructure. We don't have that baked into curricula. It's just not happening. So that's one hope. And then for your question around data, a big part of what my center does is we partner with disability advocates and civil rights organizations. And what we find time and time again is they don't have the infrastructure or the staff to do analysis, to get the data that they need to advocate for the issues they're advocating for. And that puts them behind the 8 ball when they're advocating. And so a lot of I think the work that I'm proudest of is working with those partners and sharing our data and information and resources to equip them for when they are advocating. They're not just showing up with their fierceness and their advocacy, but they're also now showing up with data. I've learned from our work, from our efforts in advocating for the NIH designation, that this relationship between the disability community, disability advocates, civil rights organizations, and researchers is not well established, that we have not connected enough to learn from those communities to help us make decisions about the research we're doing, and for us to share information in ways that is usable, in formats that are accessible, in plain language. And so I'm not sure if that's getting to the heart of your question, but I think that there's an amazing opportunity for us to share our research in so many fields and places in ways that can help the disability community make informed decisions and advocate better, and we simply have not been doing it. Yeah.
I'll do one online question and then I'll come to you. What tools, techniques, or resources are there to make my team more accessible for all? We often find our established communication channels and expectations don't work for all members of our team.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure I can completely give the answer. To me, I'm interpreting this person's question as internally within their team. Is that so? Maybe the question asker can tell me if I'm wrong. And I'll share my own experiences. So at my center, the majority of students and staff and faculty we work with are people with disabilities. And in thinking about accessibility and designing for all, there's not one size fits all approach. And it's important to understand that sometimes to make something accessible for one person might be at a detriment of access to another person. That's real. That's something that in the disability community we battle. And so there always has to be multiple pathways and avenues to accessing information, to participation, and flexibility in approach. We've done this a variety of different ways and making sure we're thinking through, is there more than one tool that can be used? Is there, a practice in the meeting that, is a way to address this issue of contrasting accessibility needs? If we share an agenda and we have a Google Doc that's running that someone can interact with, but then we also have chat, on the Zoom call, things like that. But it is constantly a learning process for myself. I think it's important to understand for all of us that this is a journey. This will never be a destination, just like so many of these efforts. And that we all need some humility in the process and to be curious and to be interested and to continuing to learn. I learn from my colleagues every day about how to be better. So I think, to be honest, that's the answer, is to be open, is to have humility, and have a best faith effort to meet everyone where they are and to make sure that people are included. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Wonderful talk, Dr. Sweeter. Just the way you articulated these important issues. I wanted to amplify and ask more about this idea of accessibility as equivalent ease of use. Mm-hmm. So much of what we deal with, as you said, is trying to figure out who's the best or who can pass the test, who can meet certain requirements to determine who gets in the door. I wanted to ask what this equivalent ease of use looks like for students today. And this may be in college, it may be in elementary or high school, it may be in graduate school, and how we can use people's skills and strengths, recognize where there may be more challenges or barriers put up because of our methods, and keep moving forward to advance our field in our society.
Yeah, well, thank you, Michelle. And this is a great question, I think a really timely one, because it mirrors conversations that I know are happening on a larger national stage around who is a scientist, who gets to be a scientist. And I apologize, I always bring it back to STEM because that's usually where my work is focused. And I think your question is directly related to that, right? Are our methods inadvertently, or our approaches, keeping people out of participating in science, participating in the process, being viewed as a scientist, getting the education? I wish I had all the answers, and I certainly do not. But I do think it does start with this broader conversation around, what are we trying to accomplish here? Are we trying to only have a few select individuals get to certain places, to get to have certain professions? Or do we want to create a society and a culture where we allow more people to have opportunities and we design systems and structures to allow that to happen? And to rethink that, oh, you couldn't cut it, or you didn't have what it took, or you just weren't cut out for this. And rethink those mentalities and think about what was the environment that person was in. Is there an environment where that person could thrive and contribute and perhaps excel? And we are all losing out, right? The reason I think about this through a lens of science and STEM is because the conversation in this country is we're behind the 8 ball in our innovation and discovery and our scientific workforce. And for people with disabilities, it's a massively untapped community of people that have been locked out of STEM, that have innovative ideas, that think about things differently, and maybe that's what we've been missing, right? And so it isn't just about the nice thing to do, it's thinking about what we can gain as in our fields, in our knowledge, in our discovery, if we rethink these approaches. But as to how we do it, I think we still have a lot of work to do, but it's a really great question. I wish I had the answer. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate you taking time.
Goes without saying. Please join me in thanking Dr. Sweeney again. Good afternoon. I'm Tabby Chavis, and I'm so thrilled to be with you today. I'm thrilled and inspired by Dr. Sweeney's insightful keynote, the questions that she was able to answer, the questions that she wasn't, but that are questions that we all are responsible for answering. Just made this talk, including all of the data, so really important and useful. And the ending comment that this is work that reflects us living our values, but it's also work that makes us better. We're doing this work because it fundamentally makes us more excellent in what we're able to do to not only impact this campus, but to impact society. Thank you, Dr. Sweeney, because your work continues to shape the way that we are understanding and integrating disability inclusion within academic workspaces, and deeply grateful for your contributions and those of your colleagues in your center as well. And your advocacy at the NIH, the federal level, and the like, too. Some new things that I learned about today. I also want to just acknowledge how wonderful it is to be gathered together for at least some of us, but virtually. So being able to have a hybrid session for the first time since the inception of this Toward an Anti-Ableist Academy conference. This event invites us all to consider how each of us, from our particular positions, roles, offices, units, network spaces, can actively work toward creating and sustaining a university environment that not only just welcomes, but fully embraces disability culture and experiences. This conference first began in 2019, and now it's in its third iteration. Thanks to many of you who are in the room or maybe joining us virtually. It's clear how much we've grown, not just as a conference event, but as an institution, but we have much more to do, and we have further to go. Today is the mark of a new chapter, and it truly feels special to be in community with all of you who are, again, joining us here or virtually. The original vision for this conference was rooted in providing updates on the work of our Student Idea Board, which stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility. The Idea Board was formed by our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to assess and recommend ways that the university could support students better who are impacted by barriers to accessibility and inclusion. And again, I'm looking around and knowing who signed up. So some of the people who are here today, virtually or in person, are part of that important group. And I will also note, even though it's called Student Idea Board, the recommendations that came out of that group had implications for our entire community, things that are relevant to our staff and faculty, including some of the issues that Dr. Sweener took up today that specifically relate to how people can participate in the workforce and the research workforce. Since then, the board's recommendations have guided us. And while we, again, acknowledge that there is much more to do, it's inspiring to see how far we've come, even in naming the issues that we need to work on in a more precise, crisp way than we ever have. For instance, we've also made significant strides toward increased accessibility as integrated into our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. We have 2 campus-wide action items focused on both physical and digital accessibility, led by central offices with the expert engagement of many, many community partners. We will continue working closely with disability advocates and leaders, those who work on these issues, as well as those who are experts because of their lived experience. And we're proud to say that, again, many of these advocates are here today and will be sharing their work and their insights with you. One key outcome of our diversity efforts has been the establishment of a Disability Equity Office. This office serves as a centralized hub for coordinating compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act and other disability-related regulations, and it marks a significant step toward a central hub for supporting accountability and consistent support for our disability community at one of the most, I'm told, decentralized campuses that exists. I mean, everyone may make that claim, but I promise you it is true of the University of Michigan. We've also made substantial investments in improving physical accessibility across campus with more to do, including removing barriers that limit access for those with mobility challenges. This includes modifying buildings and facilities by adding ramps, automatic doors, elevators, and ensuring accessible routes throughout campus. I'll also highlight that this is an area where we're engaging, as Provost McCauley said, that the ADA standard needs to be the bottom. Our standard needs to be well above the ADA standard, and that has been an interesting source of discussion and sometimes tension regarding how do we engage those with lived experience and multiple forms of expertise in helping us determine, if it's above, where do we land and how do we do that, and how do we build these things into our fiscal and financial planning so that it doesn't feel like an add-on later on. It's a part of how we're actually imagining and conceptualizing design rather than thinking about it later and then having some interesting debates about how far we need to be above ADA standards. We're providing also more accessible housing options for students with disabilities, which also has been a really interesting endeavor with regard to what that means to our very diverse disability community. Spaces that allow people to gather, or those in our community who think there need to be distributed and integrated spaces. And usually the answer is both. Right? We're trying to do these things to not just physically equip our spaces to address different disability needs, but to help our students navigate their lives with greater ease and comfort so they can fully participate. Per our inclusion goals, that we want all of our campus members to be able to participate as students, as faculty and staff in what Michigan has to provide. And it also allows us to leverage the strengths and the assets that individuals bring to our environment. There's more that I could say, but I'm keeping you between lunch for those of you who are here in person. And you're also going to hear from some of our wonderful experts and partners on campus. Students for Services for Students with Disability, or SSD, the Council for Disability Concerns, our disability culture at U of M, DC at UM, the Center for Disability Health and Wellness, and more, who will speak to their important work and progress and recommended needs for our campus and beyond. So I invite you to join us as we continue this important work and dialogue this afternoon. Thank you for being here today, those of you in person and joining us virtually. And I look forward to continued not only conversation, but partnership and action in this important work. Thank you, and we'll do a transition to lunch.